Hey guys, welcome back. We're starting with the Middle Ages today. So the Middle Ages it's going to be in two chapter parts. We're going to do the Middle Ages this chapter, and next chapter we'll do the High Middle Ages, or kind of the end of the Middle Ages. So right now what we're covering is from the year 400 to about the year 1500. So we're going to start off with the decline of the Roman Empire and kind of lead into what happens to the rest of Europe after the Roman Empire falls. So by 500, the Western Roman Empire had been replaced by mostly Germanic tribes. Those are the same tribes that kept, coming in and trying to take over and fighting the Romans. The Romans finally kind of gave in, but the Germanic tribes, even though they had conquered Rome, and overthrown the Roman Empire, they didn't really want to rule the Romans. They didn't want to. They just wanted their own territories. So whenever we're looking at some of the names in this map over here, some of them might look familiar. So for instance, the Britons over here in where Great Britain would be, the Scots over where Scotland would be, the Anglo-Saxons, Germanic tribes, the Franks, like France. Several of these should be quite familiar. Milan is still a city that we talk. A lot of these cities are still around today, also. So we'll refer to some of these as we're going through this chapter as well. So Roman influence became less in each region, most notably. Most notably in Britain, where the Romans had totally abandoned the Anglo-Saxons and they began to rule. So in Britain, you have kind of a whole different culture going on, and as a result, we'll have a completely different language. Eventually, we'll have different customs, different beliefs, and things like that. Anyway, we'll come back to that. So we start with the Franks. The Franks start with Clovis. So it's established by a man named Clovis around 500. Okay. The Roman Empire falls 476, and the Byzantine Empire still exists over in the east. But as far as the Western Empire, the Roman half where Italy is, that's all gone. So the Frankish kingdom was established by Clovis around 500. He's a strong military leader, and he married a Christian woman. So he refused to adopt Christianity as his own religion, and it even remarked to his wife, your God can do nothing. He was very blasphemous about God, didn't really care about the Christian religion itself. But he eventually comes out during a battle against another Germanic tribe. He calls out to his false gods for help, and nothing happens, supposedly, the story goes. Then he calls out to his wife's God, Jesus Christ, if you shall grant me victory over these enemies, I will believe in you and be baptized. And so the enemy eventually flees, and he converts to Christianity as a result, because he says, he'll believe in Jesus Christ, he'll be baptized, he'll believe in this religion. So Clovis succeeded in defeating surrounding Germanic tribes, and he establishes the unified kingdom of the Franks. And so this is the first large kingdom to exist after the fall of the Roman Empire. It's like the French kingdom. So supposedly the story goes, he says, Clovis took his wife Clotilde, daughter of the king of Burgundians and a Christian. The queen unceasingly urged the king to acknowledge the one true God and forsake idols, but he could not in any wise be brought to believe until war broke out with the Alemanni. The two armies were in battle, and there was a great slaughter. Clovis's army was near utter destruction. He saw the danger and raised his eyes to heaven, saying, Jesus Christ, whom Clotilde declares to be Son of the living God, who it is that givest aid to the oppressed and victory to those who put their hopes in thee, I beseech thy aid. If thou shalt grant me victory over these enemies, I will believe in thee and be baptized in thy name. For I have called upon my gods, but they are far removed from my aid. So I believe that they have no power, for they do not succor those who serve them. Now I call upon thee, and I long to believe in thee. When he had said these things, It said that the Alemanni turned their backs and began to flee when they saw that their king was killed. They submitted to the sway of Clovis, saying, "Now we are thine." So this is supposedly how the conversion of Clovis went, according to Gregory of Tours. So this picture I find kind of entertaining. It's Clovis being baptized, and he's basically like in this little bird bath. Medieval art is really two-dimensional. It's like they try to do some 3D stuff with some shading, but it's very, very two-dimensional. Anyway, so this is Clovis in the bath. Kind of looks like a child, small child. And here he is, getting the water poured over him, getting baptized, becoming a Christian. And then this is Clovis. Clovis in the bath. Clovis. So I don't know which one is more accurate. I'm gonna let you decide. So the way that Germanic people found out, determined how people were guilty or how people were to serve crimes, or if criminals had done something wrong, the way that they dealt with this was through weregild. So a weregild is basically the amount of money that you pay a wrongdoer that the wrongdoer will pay to a person of a family member that he or she has injured or killed in some way. So Germanic people are really close to their family. They're bonded by their extended family. So they live in groups of maybe I don't know, tribes with 20 to 30 family members around them. They're close to their extended family. They're close to their grandparents. Germanic laws, because they live with their family. Their family provides protection. They work land together. They pass down land to future generations together. They're really close. And so you think of it as kind of I think of it as like a small village, basically being maybe your family, then your aunts and uncles, your grandparents, your father's grandparents, your mother's grandparents, whatever. Everybody's all living together. All your brothers and sisters stay in the same village. Everybody just kind of sticks together and takes care of the same land. So Germanic laws were established by custom. If a family committed a crime against another family, then they would have to pay a fine called the weregild. Like I said, they pay this fine to the family of the person that they've wronged, and it all depended on your social status. So if you were a peasant, your weregild would be really small and insignificant, whereas if you were someone who were more prominent or elite, maybe you were a noble at this time, then your weregild would be very, very expensive. And so depending on your social status would depend on how bad your crimes would be or how expensive a crime towards you would be. So how were weregiilds determined? How did we know who was guilty or who wasn't guilty? Basically, what we would do was we would do an ordeal. And the ordeal is based on the idea of divine intervention. So basically, God isn't going to hurt someone who is innocent, is what these people thought. So if you're innocent, then you should be able to pick up this hot iron or walk through fire or put your hand in a boiling pot of water, and nothing should happen to you because divine forces are not going to allow this innocent person to be hurt. If the accused person was unharmed after a physical trial or ordeal, he or she was then presumed innocent. So trials by ordeal became the new norm for a really long time in Europe. And a lot of people were clearly taken advantage of in these situations, because what they would do is they would hope, the people who were conducting the trial, they would hope that people who were guilty of a crime would just confess before the trial would happen. And be like, okay, I did it, because they know that they're going to get hurt. But the people who are innocent, obviously they're still going to get hurt either way. So you could easily target someone who had done nothing, who had been completely innocent, and say this person stole from me, this person killed my calf or something, and we could do a trial by ordeal, and that person would come out obviously and get hurt because you're going to get burned by fire, or you're going to get burned if you stick your hand in a boiling pot of water. So then that person would be deemed guilty, even though they were probably innocent. So that happened a lot. So there were water ordeals. Here you have people being bound. They tie their hands and their feet together and then throw them in the water. And it's like, if you float, then you're guilty. But if you sink, then you're innocent. And, obviously, if most people are going to float in the water because that's just, how it happens. But, a lot of people are just basically drowned after this. Then there's the hot iron ordeal. And this woman's face always gets me. So serious. It's like nothing is bothering her, though. She's like, this doesn't hurt. This is a hot iron. I'm fine. This lady's just walking through some coals. Everybody's just hanging out, having a good time. Nobody really cares. It's just like another day at court. So how can anybody possibly pass these tests? You can't. The priest would usually manipulate the ordeal, so the result would be whatever they guessed it would be. They also thought the threat of doing these things would determine the innocent from the guilty. The guilty who believed it would hurt them, would fess up before a trial, and so on and so forth. So when we talk about the Middle Ages, we can't go too far into the Middle Ages without talking about the church, because the church is everything in the Middle Ages. This is where the church dominates politics. They have extreme authority. They are, number one, they command armies. They have the money. You don't exist as a nation without help or support from the Pope in the church. So the Christian church developed a system of organization by the 4th century. So this is after Jesus Christ is crucified, and Christianity becomes one of the most popular religions in Europe, in the world, really. So the Pope in Rome is the head of the church. Pope means Papa in Latin, so that's father. Then below archbishops, and they manage regions within the Christian realm. And then you have bishops below archbishops, and they would have a bishopric or a diocese that they would be in charge of. And then you would have the priests below bishops, and they would be in charge of manors and villages, so smaller territories. And then below the priests, you have monks and nuns, and they are in monasteries. They're not really in charge of anything. They just kind of run monasteries, which are used for learning about the Bible and religion. So this is St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican City of Rome. The Vatican City is its own location. They have their own laws, their own ordeals, but it's still a thing today. We still have a pope today, right? So back then, and even still today, Catholics believe that Jesus gave the keys of the kingdom of heaven to Peter, who was considered the chief apostle and the first bishop of Rome. So we consider Peter to be kind of the first pope. Western Christians agreed on the idea of the pope, but no one could really agree on how much power the pope is actually supposed to have. And so there's a lot of speculation on pope and how much authority he should have. So Gregory the First, known as Gregory the Great, actually strengthens the power of the papacy in the church in the 6th century. He leads the city of Rome and its surrounding territories, known as the Papal States. He increases spiritual authority over the church in the West. He's active in converting non-Christian people of Germanic Europe to Christianity through the monastic movement. And all around, he gains quite a bit of support for the church and for Christianity. Now, the problem with this is you have people who take advantage of their positions, as you do in any situation where, once you have so much authority, if you don't have anybody checking your power, then a lot of times you let that go to your head and you use that to your advantage and so on. So the monastic movement, we're going to talk about monasticism. It's a new word, bolded and underlined here for you. So first, a monk is a man who separates himself from ordinary society to dedicate his life to God. So a monk is someone who is dedicated only to God. All he wants to do is learn about God. All he wants to do is serve God. He is separating himself from regular society so that he cannot be touched by the outside world. He wants to solely serve God. So the practice of living the life of a monk is known as monasticism. You're a monk, you practice monasticism. Christian monasticism was based on the hermit who led an isolated spiritual life. So monks typically, a lot of the monasteries that we see in the Middle Ages are located far, far away from normal society, far away from cities. Like they're on tops of mountains, they're on like cliffs near the edges of seas, like high up, far away from normal society, so that people can't get to them very easily, so that they won't be disturbed, so that they can better serve God, so that they can better learn about God. So one of the saints, Saint Benedict, who was a monk, wrote a set of rules to guide a community of monks that he had founded in the 6th century. And this community became a model for monasticism in the Catholic Church. And the Benedictine rule was used by other monastic groups as well. So it's named after him. It's called Benedictine rule. And it's just rules that popes are supposed to follow. So basically, his rule divides each day into a series of activities with emphasis on prayer and manual labor. Physical work was required of all monks for several hours a day because idleness was the enemy of the soul. So you have to work and do things around the monastery. Like you can't just kind of chill out and like sleep all day. Prayer included private meditation and reading. But all monks gathered 7 times during the day for common prayer and the chanting of psalms, which are sacred songs. So monks ate, worked, slept, and worshiped together as a community. Each Benedictine monastery was led by an abbot or a father who had complete authority over the monks. Each monastery had lands so that they could be self-sustaining and so that they could be isolated from the world. So the lands that they would have animals, they would have crops, they would have their own little community to take care of themselves, to feed themselves, to clothe themselves, so that they didn't have to go to towns and that people didn't have to come visit them. So this is your typical typical day of a monk. Okay, so this is in the morning time, 2:00 in the morning. You start out with a church service. 3:30, you go to sleep. So an hour and a half church, have a little sleep time for about 30 minutes. 4:00, wake up for another church service. And then 5:00, you'd have reading and private prayer. Then 6:00, you'd have another church service and breakfast. You'd start work at 7 until 8:00. Then you'd have another church service. Then you'd work at 9:15. And then you'd have another church service at 11:45. And then you'd have a meal at lunch. At 1:00, you'd have a reading or private prayer. You'd sleep again at 1:45 because you need an afternoon nap. And then at 3:00, you'd work. At 5:45, you have another meal. 6:00 church service, 7:15 reading or private prayer. 7:45 church service, and then 8:00 you go to sleep, and you get a nice 6 hours of sleep here before you start up and do it all again. It's a long day. So the monastic community set the standard for Christian life, and it provided a moral example of everybody. Monks are the social workers of their communities. They provide for school. They provide schools for the young, hospitality for travelers, and hospitals for the sick even. They're like hotels for the Middle Ages, is how I would think of them. They also taught peasants carpentry and weaving and made agricultural improvements that they passed on to others. So while they're isolated and while they like thrive on being closer to God and like further away from society, they also still remember that, like the point is not to just like isolate yourself completely from society. You have to help society too. And so they contribute to an extent. So monasteries become centers for learning. English and Irish monks were missionaries who undertook the conversion of non-Christians. By 1050, most Western Europeans had become Catholics, thanks to the monastic movement. So monks are like a huge part of Middle Ages. You also have nuns. Okay, women known as nuns began to withdraw from the world to dedicate themselves from God as well. These women played an important role in the monastic movement. They lived in convents headed by abbesses. The abbesses were responsible for giving learning an important role in life in the monastery and helping to educate future bishops. So Nuns also play a large role. They're kind of like the female version of the monk. So moving on, we're going to talk about the Carolingian Empire. So the Frankish kings lose their power to mayors of the palace in 600 and 700s. Basically, they would have these mayors of the palace who would be kind of like not really servants, but they're nobility. They're just not that cool. They're just kind of like a step down. So one of the most famous of these mayors was Pepin the Short. So what he does is he actually manipulates his position of power and convinces the Pope to crown him as king, and then sends the actual king to a monastery. So basically, he tells the Pope that the king is he's like losing his mind, because he's like an advisor to the king, is what you think of these the mayors as. They're like advisors, nobility, like people who are supposed to be close with the king. So he goes back and he's like telling the Pope that this king is like losing his mind, like he's not making right decisions. And the Pope is like, well, maybe you should take over or whatever, like no big deal. He gets really close with the Pope. So he shaves the Pope's head, because shaving your head was a sign that you were mentally unwell, mentally unstable, and sends him to a monastery so that he can learn more about God, and then takes over. His son, Charles the Great, or Charlemagne, becomes the new Frankish king in 768 and rules until 814 after that. So Pepin was not one to be messed with. So Charlemagne is really intelligent and decisive. He's determined. He's one of the greatest rulers that, the Franks see. He's a wise supporter of learning, and he expands the Frankish kingdom and creates what is known as the Carolingian Empire. So to administer the empire, he had a household staff and counts, which were German nobles, who acted as the king's loyal representatives. Then he had Missi Dominici. So Missi Dominici are just messengers of the Lord King. And basically, he would send these people out into the public and have them kind of like spy on everybody and spy on his representatives to make sure that people were doing what he asked them to do. He's like, report back to me if they're not, enacting these laws. Report back to me if they're talking crap about me. Report back to me if they're trying to take over. So basically, he's a little paranoid, little on the paranoid side, but he's got things in order, and he knows who's on his side, and he knows how to keep people in line to an extent as well. Kind of smart. So Charlemagne's empire becomes known as the Kingdom of Europe. He becomes the emperor of the Romans in 800. So his coronation symbolizes the idea of a lasting Roman Empire and the joining of Roman, Christian, and Germanic elements, because he's a German ruling over a Roman Empire sanctioned by the church. So he's not, he's definitely like favored by the Pope. The Pope's like, yeah, like we want this Roman Empire back, because the Roman Empire fell before, so they want another one, because like then the Pope can have more power. The more kingdoms that we have as a church to rule over, the more power that they have. So Charlemagne's efforts to promote learning in his kingdom led to an intellectual revival known as the Carolingian Renaissance, or rebirth. The monasteries played a central role in his cultural renewal. Basically, he would have monks work in writing rooms, or the scriptoria, and copy manuscripts like the Bible and classic Latin works. They started calling these writing rooms the scriptoria mumbling chambers, because your monks would be like copying down by hand, and they would start mumbling the words as they were writing down. So they call them like the mumbling chambers. Most of the ancient Roman works that we have today exist because the monks continued to copy them down. So the Arabs had translated a lot of these works into Latin, and then the monks take them and they make copies so that more and more people can have access to them. So the Carolingian Empire falls apart after Charlemagne's death in 814. The kingdom is then divided into Western Frankish lands, Eastern Frankish lands, and the Middle Kingdom. And so since his land is all split up, it's harder to keep control of. Western Europe is then invaded in the 9th and 10th centuries by Muslims in the south. Magyars from Western Asia in the east, and then Vikings come in and invade from the north. So they have attacks coming in from like all around their kingdom, and they don't really have a way to keep track of everything because they're all split up now. So the Vikings are another important people that we need to talk about if we're going to talk about the Middle Ages. They're Germanic people who loved adventure and search for spoils of war and new avenues of trade. So what they would do is they would roll up, sack villages and towns, destroy churches, defeat small local armies, and then they would loot and take the booty home and do it all again. They would hit as many places as they could. They were really big on hitting monasteries because they were right on the shores. And Vikings were like a seafaring people. They had really nice ships. They had mastered the art of shipbuilding. A lot of people kind of acknowledged the fact that they were master shipbuilders and they were great at sailing and, wanted help from them. We could use some help making some ships like this. We would actually be in pretty good shape if we could build some nice ships that are as durable and that are, able to sail this far. So beginning in 911, the ruler of the Western Frankish lands gave one band of Vikings land at Normandy. So these Vikings get their own piece of land in Normandy, and they become a part of European civilization. They're no longer these crazy savages that are just kind of running around enjoying the spoils of war. They're settling down and staying in one spot now. They're no longer sacking different villages or anything like that. And a lot of them start converting to Christianity. And so it changes the way people look at Vikings as well. They're no longer really Vikings. They've become a part of society. So here is Normandy. And whenever the Vikings get this land in Normandy, they're promised, along with that land, they should have some political authority as well. So eventually we get to William the Conqueror. Here's one of the Viking ships, like a replica of a Viking ship. So feudalism, this is good. So you have a pyramid over here that shows you feudal society. You've got the Pope and the Church separate from society. They are privileged. They are at the very top. No one can touch the Pope. Pope is number one. Right below the Pope, you've got the king at the top of the pyramid. Then you have nobles. Then you have knights and vassals. And then you have merchants, farmers, craftsmen, peasants, and serfs. So for protection after the fall of the Roman Empire, because they no longer had a Roman Empire with kings to protect people from being ravaged or sacked by these Germanic tribes, people start looking to knights and vassals to protect them. They look for people to protect them. It's look, the reason that you knew if someone was wealthy or not was determined on how much land that they had. So the king owned all the land. Everything belonged to the king. But he would give nobles pieces of land if the nobles would, hire vassals and knights to protect them. So the king would be like, here's some land for you, here's some land for you, so that he would give out manors or fiefs to each to nobles. And then from that, the nobles would then be able to give pieces of land to knights and vassals. And knights and vassals are the ones who would do the fighting and the protecting. Nobles are in charge of protection too, but So powerful nobles gained control of larger areas of land, and then they would need men to fight for their protection. So the nobles would then give manors or fiefs to their vassals who, basically a vassal is just someone who swears to protect someone. A knight can be a vassal. Lords in this situation, your lords, your nobles, print their own money. They collect taxes, they demand military service, and they provide their own justice systems. So they're kind of really the ones that are running the show. The king is just a figurehead of authority, he's the king, but the nobles are the ones who really have the power. So a vassal would perform a public act of homage to his lord. He'd basically put his hands together as a sign of humility and place them between the two hands of the lord.
as a token that he vows everything to him and promises faith to him. And the Lord should receive him and promise to keep faith with him. Then the man should say, Sir, I enter your homage in faith and become your man by mouth and hands. And I swear and promise to keep faith and loyalty to you against all others. And after that, like he would do this publicly. And after this person would be like contracted to this lord, and he would have to fight for him. So a vassal would be required to help administer justice. He would have to contribute money if they needed to. He'd have to answer the summons of battle and bring men with him to fight if they needed to fight. He'd have to feed and house the Lord and his people when they traveled across his land, which was no easy feat. On one trip, William the Conqueror and his household consumed the following within just a few days for a Christmas feast: 6,000 chickens, 1,000 rabbits, 90 boars, 50 peacocks. Yes, they eat peacocks. 200 geese, 10,000 eels, thousands of eggs and loaves of bread, and then hundreds of bottles of wine and cider. So it's safe to say that providing for these lords is not very cheap. Now, the lords, they simply just have to protect the vassal, give military aid if they need, and then guard the vassal's children. Pretty easy. Your peasants usually lived in villages of 10 to 60 families because your peasants and your serfs are at the bottom. So there's a difference between peasants and serfs. Peasants are people who, they're just poor. They're not slaves. They're not serfs. They're not tied to land. They just are poor. So they usually live in villages of 10 to 60 families. They live in rough huts with dirt floors. They don't have chimneys or roofs in their homes, if you can imagine the smell. The hut sometimes houses animals too. They would have beds made of straw or leaves. And typically their diets consisted of porridge, black bread, cheese, and a few homegrown vegetables here and there. They didn't have to work on Sundays, and they could travel to local markets. They have a lot of freedoms. They just don't have very much money. Now, your serfs, on the other hand, are a lot harsher than the peasant's life. They're not really a slave, but they're bound to the Lord for life. And so they have to work that land. They can't own property. They don't own any property. The land that they live on is the Lord's land, and they just work it for him. They need the Lord's permission to marry. They can't leave the land without permission unless he ran away and stayed free for at least 1 year. Then he could be free. So he did have some rights. So he wasn't required to fight for the Lord, and he was entitled to protection from the Lord as well.